All right, I am Melissa Tucci. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So I am from Lincoln, born and raised. I have history working a lot with nonprofit agencies here in Lincoln, doing some in-home work, and then I have worked in the schools before going to private practice. So I used to previously run a substance use focused program in the high schools and middle schools, and again working a lot with children, adolescents, families, a lot of experience with trauma. Did some in-home work in terms of helping families that were at risk of their kids leaving the home or were trying to have their kids be reunified in the home. And then in 2017, I had the idea, 7 months pregnant, to start private practice, and started private practice in 2017, and then eventually wound up joining my husband last April. So we are in the same building, under the same practice, but we have separate offices, and I always tell everyone my office is better. So that's a little bit about me.
Hey, I'm James. I've been in practice, let's see, for, this is 2020, so roughly 13 years. I've worked in agencies and did some internships in hospitals, residential care, this kind of thing, in-home therapy as well. I've been in private practice since 2008, and what I consider full-time since 2014, 15, something like that. I see a range of individuals with a lot of different things going on. I suppose my specialty or expertise is in anxiety and depression, fairly common, and I'm sure none of you are surprised by that. Got my undergrad degree in religious studies at Doane, and I really liked that major, but not until my junior year did I realize I didn't want to be a pastor or a professor in religious studies. That was not a thing that sounded exciting to me, but the knowledge was really helpful, and it still is today. I decided to go into counseling, and I'm glad that I did. I went to Doane, Lincoln for my master's in counseling. So I've been doing this again for about 12, 13 years, something like that, and I really enjoy it. So for tonight, as Melissa and I were talking about how to set this up and how to talk about this, we really like this to be I don't know, almost informal, conversational. So please, 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 if any of you have any questions at any time, feel free to interrupt, shout, stand up, do whatever, and we'll take a question, as soon as we're done making a point or whatever. We want this to be useful for you all. This hopefully won't be too boring. We're not going to talk a ton about stats and that kind of stuff because we're not psychologists, and anytime we've gone to continuing ed, that's super boring. So we want this to be actually useful. Since we work with people, we want to share that with you all. So we will do our best to tailor it in a way that I think makes sense, hopefully. And if there's something specific, please let us know for sure. Just a little disclaimer. This is not, therapy. Sometimes when we do presentations and workshops, we have somebody that asks a question specifically about themselves or their kid and how to address that issue. So we won't answer that question. We will, direct you to a professional or something, right? So I think that is it on my end for now. Okay, Melissa, take it over.
All right, so as James said, we want it to be pretty informal, but I am now standing at a podium, and I'm going to start with an attention grabber, unintentionally. So this phrase, James and I did a workshop through First Plymouth about parenting, and we do a lot of that, and there's a phrase that always stuck with me that I thought was really important, so I wanted to share it before I talk about symptoms of anxiety and depression. So this is from No Drama Discipline by Dan Siegel, and they talk about if we focus only on our child's behavior, so their external world, and neglect the reasons behind that behavior, their internal world, then we'll only concentrate on the symptoms, not the cause that's producing them. And if we consider only the symptoms, we'll have to keep treating those symptoms over and over again. I think that's so important because a lot of times, and with therapy, people come to us, that's the first thing is this is what I'm experiencing, and they go out over symptom after symptom, and if we just focus on that, that's where you see, I mean, therapy can go on forever. And I know from experience working in the schools, that was often the complaint is when is therapy going to be done? Even from clients, that is what they want. You know, when is therapy going to be done? And so it's super important, I think, awareness of symptoms, yes, but it's looking more at that what is the cause, you know, and I think even with health today, that's often the case. You know, you go to the doctor and you're prescribed things where it's like, but why am I taking this? James and I have 2 little girls at home, 3 and 2, and we've kind of experienced that with our 3-year-old who has had a history of digestive issues and lactase deficient peanut allergy and cashew, right? So we got dealt quite the hand, and oftentimes when trying to figure this out, it's just being prescribed a laxative and being told, well, it was only the behavior. She's withholding her poop, and as her parents, we knew that wasn't the case, you know, so it's more about getting to the root issue, and as a parent, you know, as a therapist, I don't want to just keep focusing on the behavior and how to get rid of it. It's looking at, well, what's causing it? I don't want to just keep giving her a laxative instead of, and have it not be effective. I will address the noise. I think there's a musical going on. Yes, yes, so side note. So this will practice our attention skills and focusing in here and not getting distracted by that. So anyway, but just being able to, again, not get so caught up on the symptoms. You know, I think, again, I know for me, there's various things where it's so easy. I'll be honest, last night, again, thinking about my daughter, I wanted to be able to focus and prepare on this presentation, but it was like I got totally hooked by symptoms, like, well, maybe she has this. Google, you know, and it's like, well, maybe it's a thyroid problem, maybe it's this, and constantly trying to look for a way to get rid of it. And I think that's one thing that James and I, in terms of therapy, really focus on, is a lot of this is it's more how can you live with this stuff, how can you embrace it, rather than constantly trying to get rid of. So with that being said, before I get again into the symptoms and anxiety, I'm going to kind of keep teasing you guys with that and make you wait. So I think one of the things that's also super important when dealing with children and adolescents and, you know, young adults even, is keeping in mind brain development. And usually when someone comes into my office, and whether it's a teenager, a little kid, you know, their parents, or even I get a lot of students from UNL, college age, I talk about brain development because I think it's so important. So, and usually I draw a picture, but I can't do that. So I will use my own head. So in terms of brain development, this part of the brain, which for kids, we always talk about in terms of wizard brain. So I always tell kids it's like a wizard, right? What makes a wizard? You know, they're magical, they're all knowing. So this is where the problem solving part of our brain is. It's impulse control. It's the ability to feel an emotion and still, you know, think logically. So it's the logic-based part of our brain. Then usually we say on the right side is more of our emotions. And then on the very far back, where the back of your head meets your neck, that's going to be your fight, flight, or freeze response, or what we call the lizard brain for simplistic reasons when working with kids. So fight, flight, or freeze, involuntary responses, essentially the part of the brain that keeps us safe. So in terms of brain development, the brain grows from the bottom up. So the last part to develop is impulse control, problem solving, logic, and that doesn't fully develop till 25. So I think that's super important because kids, and thinking of our own girls, I see it all the time. They're 15 months apart, but you can tell the difference in where they are at times in terms of brain development. But just so quick, you know, right, to get upset, to hit, to kick, to, you know, do those symptoms that we often see, where it again, and James will talk about it later in terms of parenting, being able to understand where your child is at, where your adolescent is at, or where your young adult is at, and it doesn't go away, you know, it's still, that's how our brain functions. So Just being able to take that into account to better understand and realize, some of the stuff, kids are more emotional, they're going to be more emotionally reactive. They're going to get anxious more easily. That's why they're scared of monsters under the bed. There's things that as adults, it's like, that's not real, but that's where their brain goes. And I even shared with James today, and this kind of, touches a little bit later about what I'll talk about in terms of our thoughts, but just being, that's where you might hear things too, in terms of being emotional. My daughter is upset, and right away she went to "nobody likes me," and she's 3, and I don't know where she heard that, because that's not how we talk, but that's just, what our brain does and when we're in that emotional mind. And again, we'll kind of get into that a little bit more about how to respond. So in terms of symptoms of anxiety, I'll kind of give you the straight definition from the DSM. It's excessive anxiety and worry occurring more days than not for 6 months about a number of events or activities. Another thing with that is the individual finds it difficulty to control the worry, and I want to really stress that one because I'll come back to it later. Anxiety and worry are associated with the following 6 symptoms, with at least one symptom having been present for more days than not for the past months. With children, though, it's only one of these symptoms. So it could be restlessness, difficulty sitting still, and as a side note, it's important because a lot of these symptoms you'll see are in other diagnoses, or they could get misdiagnosed with attention deficit disorder. So restlessness, feeling keyed up on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or mind going blank, irritability, and I think that's a big one too with children and adolescents. Is a lot of this stuff, they don't have a specific diagnostic criteria that you follow for kids, and so this with kids, in terms of anxiety and depression, I'd say that's a big one that a lot of times you see, is that irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbance, and what I always tell people too in terms of sleep disturbance, and I won't go into it a ton, with some of this stuff is just because they have a sleep disturbance, and it doesn't automatically mean is it anxiety or depression. It's being able to look at what are their sleep patterns before bed. Could this be an actual sleep disorder that then is causing the anxiety and depression? So I think it's important because a lot of times you'll hear this stuff, and again, it's like, oh, it's anxiety or it's ADHD, and I have so many people come in my office where part of my job as a therapist is to be able to consider the bigger picture. Is there something else? Is there a thyroid problem like I thought possibly with my daughter? That probably is not accurate. So just being able to take in and rule out any other things, because again, we're so quick to just think it's mental health, it's anxiety, it's depression, it's ADHD. The anxiety, worry, or physical symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And that's important too, because James and I were talking. I'll be honest, I'm anxious right now. I think James is anxious. It's being able to realize anxiety does exist, and I always talk to, again, anyone that I'm working with, that emotions serve a purpose. And again, anxiety is from that fight, flight, or freeze response. That's what keeps us safe. And so when anxiety shows up, I had anxiety about this presentation that I utilized to help me prepare for it, so I didn't just come up here and not have anything prepared. And so anxiety, it's being able to recognize it, but noticing, maybe when it's creeping into kind of more than one area of your life. But again, anxiety, it's not always bad. Depression, 5 or more of the following symptoms must be present. So depressed mood for most of the day, feels sad, empty, or hopeless. And I think that's one thing too, with children and adolescents, they're not going to use the same language that adults do, where you do get adults that come in and say, I feel depressed, or I feel sad. They might talk about it in a different way or a vague way, or they might use, analogies. I have a lot of people too that will talk about, it feels like I'm drowning or I'm suffocating, or they might draw a picture and describe it that way. So it's looking, they might not always say they're sad because they might not know how to verbalize it. So it's looking in terms of other areas how it might show up. It is also depressed, or less enjoyment and interest in activities, significant weight loss or weight gain, which in children, that's really when they're not making their expected weight gain. insomnia or hypersomnia nearly every day, slower movement, and that's observable, recurrent thoughts of dying, and it's not just fear of dying, because that often shows up too with kids. It's also recurrent thoughts of dying with a plan or without a plan or possibly an attempt, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling worthless, inappropriate guilt, and then memory and concentration issues. So again, looking at those, there are overlap, and so again, that's why it's important to, just because there is a symptom there doesn't mean that it's automatically this thing. So going through this, I know last night, even looking at some of this stuff and before and thinking about it as I go through it, I mean, did anyone have experience anxiety like, well, maybe somebody I know has it, or maybe my own kid has it? I know even again last night I was like, well, then maybe my daughter's just anxious. Maybe, she has an anxiety disorder. But that's what happens, and that's why it's important, yes, to have this information, but still hold it at a distance instead of automatically think that is the thing that's going on. So the next thing I think is important to talk about is just misconceptions in terms of emotions or mood, and particularly depression and anxiety. So the first myth is that happiness is a natural state of all human beings. So we kind of talk in ways, and we're, as a society, we think, that we want to be happy, right? It's always about being happy. And the more we strive to be happy, the more we reinforce that feelings like anxiety and sadness are bad. They're negative, they're unhealthy, they're problematic. And then what happens is then when we don't experience happiness and we hold this belief that happiness, is the state that we're supposed to have, it just creates even more unhappiness. So the reality is emotions come and go, throughout the day. They constantly change, and that's again something I talk about is we don't often pay attention to even sometimes when we're happy, right? We just notice when we're not feeling good, when we're feeling sad. So it's being able to realize that happiness, it's not just this eternal state of happiness that you get, throughout life. It ebbs and it flows. You might have a moment that you're happy, and you might have a moment that you're sad. And so a lot of clients will come in too and say, I just want to be happy. And I think that's something that I really practice right from the beginning, is letting them know that I would love for you to be happy, but that isn't something I can guarantee, and that's not really a goal, is just to be happy. Because if that's what your goal is, and that's what I, agree your goal can be, then I don't know if we're going to get there, right? Because life is full of ups and downs. It's full of stress, it's full of, work stress, relationship stress, all of that stuff, being a parent, anything like that, can pull from that feeling of happiness. The next myth is if you're not happy and experience different emotional states, such as anxiety and or depression, then you are defective. So we assume that mental suffering is abnormal. Again, it's like, what's wrong with me? Why am I feeling this way? Therefore, when we do inevitably experience painful thoughts and feelings, we often criticize ourselves for being weak or stupid. And so part of this is being able to understand, again, back to the brain, back to how we have evolved. So if we go back to when we were hunters and gatherers, our sole purpose, the mind's sole purpose, was to keep us safe, to essentially not get killed. So and how we did that was by finding food, water, shelter, and sex. So that was the goal. And so from that's where our mind started to compare and evaluate, right? It's looking at, okay, is this safe or not safe, good or bad? Constantly going back to that end goal of keeping us safe, keeping us alive. And then comes comparisons, being part of a clan. The thing you didn't want to have happen was to get kicked out of that clan. And if you did, then you're probably going to die, right? So it's comparing. Am I fitting in? Am I doing enough? Am I part of the group? And so comparing, evaluating, then comes criticizing ourselves, focusing on what we're lacking, always striving for more. Another thing was looking at, it was always more, right? More food meant better chance of survival. More kids meant, again, better chance they would survive and your offspring would survive. So we fall into this trap, which still exists today, in terms of comparing, right? You go through and you look at social media or magazines, TV, and it's like, they have a better life, they look happier than me, you know, and it's comparing, or this person at work is doing better than me, evaluating what I'm doing as good or bad. And with the mind evolving that way, if it's always looking for problems, when it comes to us, that's where, if I'm involved in a problem, it's going to say that then I am bad, right? Or I am no good, I am stupid, I am, you know, all these things as a way, again, to keep us safe, you know, to try to fix the problem. So again, it leads us to, or it's important to understand how the mind has evolved, because it still exists, it's still doing its job, and it's doing a really, really good job. It's just that then it creates problems for us. So part of it, again, that we'll discuss later, and I won't get too much into it, is just learning how to be able to notice that and really look at, okay, is this helping me right now, or is this hurting me, you know, and not get caught into that mind still doing its job. So, but with that, if that's how our mind is, you know, as adults we do it, and as kids, you know, and they're going to quickly adopt to what they hear. And I think of people in our lives that sometimes are around our girls that I think do so in a way that they don't totally believe it, but they might say things like, I'm stupid. And now our girls will walk around and they say certain things like that. They mess up. Well, that was bad. That was a bad job. I'm stupid. And so it's very quickly absorbed. So it's even being mindful, you know, as a parent, as an educator, whatever role you have, noticing your own traps that you get hooked on, you know, in terms of thinking you're a certain way, and then how that's what we're teaching children and adolescents to believe as well. So, but something with that is then, well, what do you do? And I think of the phrase, you know, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words can never hurt you. Most people have heard that. I think as we work with younger and younger kids, they look at me dumbfounded and are like, what are you talking about? And I'm not that old. But so, you know, it's like, well, I heard that, but I never got taught how to do it. And it was just, I think you get messages, well, you just ignore it, right? And it's like, well, but I heard it, right? I can't unhear it. It's in my mind. And it's still there, you know, so we get taught this, but we never get taught how. And so again, I think I'm gonna put it on James and maybe teach you how to do that later. So note to James, we're a team. So the next myth or misconception is, to create a better life, we must get rid of negative feelings like anxiety and depression. So here's what I want you to do. Some people have paper, it looks like. If you don't have paper, it's not a big deal. Just listen and think about it. So if you have paper, I want you to write down, basically psychologists have agreed that there's 9 basic emotions. So I want you to write these down. Joy, fear, anger, shock, love, disgust, sadness, guilt, and curiosity. So then I want you to go through that list, or if you didn't write it down, think about it. And if you have it written down, circle the ones that you think or you have been taught that are good. And then just put an X by the ones that are bad. 3. Okay, was that probably what everyone had? Around 3? Okay, so, you know, it's looking at, and where did you get that message? You know, again, we're taught here's these good feelings and here's the bad ones. Well, but most of the feelings we feel are bad, right? You know, and if it goes back to the brain and how our mind has evolved, and those are going to be looked at as a problem. And so what does our mind tell us to do? What is the solution? To get rid of them, right? To avoid them. And the reality is, the more we avoid those emotions, the more we feel them. And I always think of a couple things. So I'll start with, I don't know why this movie always sticks with me, but it's with The Rock. And I think it's San Andreas, yes, and I always forget it. Okay, so, but with that movie, there's a scene, and I think this movie sticks with me because I'm deathly afraid of any world catastrophe like this. So anyway, it's slightly traumatizing, but there's a scene where the ocean's pulling back and people are kind of like go out and are staying there, and he knows, The Rock, I don't know his name in the movie, looks and he's like, no, he's like, get out, get out. And because he knows what's happening is a huge tsunami wave is coming, right? And it crashes in. I always explain that's a lot what happens with our emotions, right? It's awesome to push them away, and it's like, ooh, what's this? We can be on the bottom of the ocean, this is cool. But little do we know, it comes crashing in, and it gets stronger and it knocks us off our feet. And so the more we push them away, the bigger it gets. I think of another thing for me, what I when I talk to clients about is even just in my own life in terms of experiencing unpleasant emotions. And I think of, I had just a year of 3 deaths, close people in my life that obviously I had an emotional response like anyone would, and I was extremely anxious. But at that same time, I was in grad school to become a therapist and do what I'm doing now. And I was so anxious that I couldn't even admit or say that I was anxious. I could talk about it in school in terms of what anxiety was, but I couldn't say it to myself because I thought in my mind, if I admitted it, I had an image that I literally thought like my head would crack open and I would just die, right? And I can laugh about it now because it sounds silly, and I think of stories, I hear clients that talk about some of these things, that what they think will happen if they feel this. It's like a lot of it is I'm just gonna drop over dead. And so it wasn't until I started to acknowledge and admit that I was anxious that it started to go away. And it was like I could breathe, and it wasn't constantly a fight of trying to get rid of it, trying to control it. And I can think again of a time it came up in my life after having our first baby, and I was just anxious and overwhelmed, by everything. And luckily I'm married to a therapist, James, and I just remember sitting there holding my baby, like crying, because in my mind I thought, I'm gonna go back to that spot. I'm gonna be so anxious and I can't do it. It had all those thoughts that I can't do it, I won't survive. How will I take care of this baby? And I remember James like looking at me, probably slightly horrified that I'm sobbing, holding our baby. And he came over and he said, he's like, what are you feeling? I said, anxiety or whatever I said. And he's like, just say, I'm feeling anxious and it's okay. He's like, just repeat it. And I did, and I think that's how I didn't stay stuck in it. It's like I acknowledged that I was there. I felt it, I would talk about it when I needed to, but that's how it finally went away, instead of avoiding it, not talking about it, pushing it away. It's like, oh, not going to think about it now. And when it does, it will come crashing back. So again, it's really being able to embrace those feelings, and how you do that is, again, I won't say a whole lot, but just being aware of it, noticing it like I did, accepting that it's there rather than fighting it. And it's tied in with that. It goes back to that idea of we're obsessed with finding happiness. It's bad if we are anxious. It's bad if we're sad. It's bad if, we're fearful, instead of, hey, it's okay, right? Like James told me, it's okay. And that's what helped me finally to just allow it to pass and know it wasn't going to kill me in the end. So part of that too is knowing that in life, okay, having a baby, I love my kids. And I think that was one of the most important things in my life that has happened. But with that came sadness. With it comes anxiety, right? As I'm always Googling what is wrong with my daughter. That's probably nothing is totally wrong with her. But still my mind trying to keep her safe. But with that, so it's not just all pleasant, it's not just all happiness. In relationships, I hear so many people say, I don't want to get into this relationship because I'm scared of getting hurt, right? I'm scared of being vulnerable or all this. And I always tell them that's part of the process. It's not just the honeymoon phase of happiness and all this stuff, and then you just don't deal with any of the bad. And that's kind of what happens, and my guess that's probably why our marriage or divorce rate is so high, because it's like people just want to deal with the good. It's like, oh, you got sick, I don't want to deal with that, or you have this problem, I don't want to deal with that, instead of being able to embrace it and work through it. So part of that is being willing to experience, like I was, I'm willing to experience anxiety every day in order to have my 2 little girls. The last myth is we should be able to control what we think and feel. And this one is one that we hear time and time again in terms of therapy. And even despite practicing some of the things that we practice in therapy, talking about some of this stuff, it's, you know, people come back in and it's like, I just couldn't stop that. I just couldn't stop that thought. So the reality is, despite what we're told, we have far less control about that we are able to control our thoughts and feelings. And I'll admit, you know, early on, getting out of school and just being a new therapist, I mean, that is something I practice. You know, it's like, well, just think positive, right? But then you learn, like with anything else, and you experience stuff like deaths and all that, where it's like, I don't know about you, but I don't think there's anything positive when you have a loved one die, you know, when you have a child die, or things that happen to us in life that just suck. You know, there's nothing good about it. And the more we try to think positive, the more it doesn't work. The thing that we're able to control, instead of being so focused on our thoughts and our feelings, is our actions. So, you know, it's being able to feel angry, and if being kind is important to me, to still be kind. It's being able to feel tired, but still, you know, you can still work out or exercise. And I think as I've read stuff, that was one that really resonated with me in terms of, I was like, oh yeah, I don't know why I never thought about that you can be tired and then go work out. Where a lot of times I would stop at that. I would stop at the feeling, well, I'm tired, you know, so the solution my mind came up to keep me safe, don't go exercise, right? But that's kind of the cycle that we get caught in, is that we get so caught in terms of our thoughts or our feelings, you know, and especially our feelings, that it's like, I'm feeling this way, therefore, you know, I'm not going to do this thing. Because again, it goes back to those feelings that our mind is trying to protect us from, that we have determined that they're bad or negative. So, you know, part of that is, well, let's try an experiment, I guess, just to kind of emphasize this a little bit further. So, first experiment we're going to do is, I want you to think of a dessert. So I'll describe one, but I think not everyone likes what I'm going to describe. So I want you to think of, or it doesn't have to be a dessert, it could be whatever food you like. I'm a big food person, so I always talk about food. So a dessert, I think of an apple pie I make, which is not your typical apple pie. It's a Swedish apple pie. So it's apples and cinnamon and maple syrup, and it's covered with this really gooey crust and baked to perfection, that I think is perfection. And then I top it with a super bad for you powdered sugar glaze, you know, and it's warm, and it's the best thing ever, I think. And I try to make him think that as well. But so for the next, well, it doesn't matter how long, I want you guys, whether you think about that pie that I just described, or if you had something else in your mind, they're not going to think about it. And every time you think about it, you can note it in your head or mark it down. Do everything you can not to think about that pie that's really warm and tasty and delicious. So, without asking for people how many times, I'm going to guess that most people couldn't do it. Is that kind of right? At some point, because even the thought of thinking, I don't want to think about it, you're still thinking about it, right? You know, so that's what happens. And actually, an old intervention in terms of therapy used to be thought stopping. You know, well, just don't think of it. Stop yourself from thinking about it. Well, now I'm thinking about it. And the more I try not to think about something, the more I think about it, right? Or in terms of worry, I think that's one. When people are worried, I think the common response we tell people is, well, just don't worry about it. It's not going to happen, right? And we talk logic to them instead of that's a worry they have, right? And it's acknowledging the worries there. And just like I was worried, my head was going to crack open, I was going to die. You might all think, well, that's crazy and it's not going to happen. It was still there, right? So no matter how hard I would have tried to stop thinking about it, it still would have came up. So another experiment is, imagine that you could get $1 million if you could get rid of all the trash in your house. So think of whatever's in your house, you get rid of all the trash. That's step one. Step two is that for the next week, you can't have any negative, unpleasant feeling. Do you think you could do it? Or do you think the stress of being so concerned about not having any unpleasant feeling would lead it to it, right? You know, so it's looking at, we just can't help it. And again, that's something so many times people are like, I don't know why I'm feeling this way. And I always tell them, I don't know either, you know, and we don't always have to know why. It's just sometimes that happens, you know, a feeling exists, right? Or thinking about The Bachelor is another experiment I won't have you do, but it's picking a spot in the room, you know, fixating on it, making yourself believe you love it, you know, to the point that you are in love with that spot. You want to tell everyone about that spot. You want to build a shrine to that spot, and thinking about, okay, can you do it? Probably not, right? Because that would be a little bit bizarre, but that the idea that we can't, just like we can't take away those negative feelings, we also can't make ourselves love, right? We can't make ourselves happy. You know, thinking about The Bachelor, I think that's what you see all the time. It's like, I don't know, I don't feel the same way. You know, I tried, right? And it's like, well, I don't know if there's any trying if you just can't help if the feeling doesn't exist. So this is also, you know, in terms of this myth and trying to control what we think and feel, is where, again, mentioning, you know, thinking, taking those negative, turning them to positive. And what happens is, I had this revelation the other day where it's a lot like arguing with somebody, or even, you know, arguing with a kid. And I was trying to explain this to a girl that had a thought at a young age, you know, that I am ugly, and trying to help her look at, okay, you know, it's just a thought. And I could have sat there with her and said, well, let's think about why you're beautiful, and let's think about all this stuff. But so I told her, I was like, okay, you're going to argue yes, and I'm going to argue no. And she's like, so we just went back and forth. And if you've ever done that with a kid, I actually did it today with my daughter, unexpectedly, but it's like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And it just keeps going back and forth, right? And it gets exhausting. And that's the same thing that happens in our mind, is that it just keeps going, right? It's like, I am ugly. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. You know, it just goes back and forth. And so it doesn't work. It doesn't get the thought to stop. So we spend a lot of time and effort trying to get rid of negative thoughts and negative feelings, but it has little effectiveness. This leads us to feel inadequate when our attempts to control the thoughts and feelings fail. So again, it's like, what's wrong with me? And that's the other thing I'll hear is like, I don't know what's wrong with me. No matter what I do, I just can't stop the thought from happening, or I just can't stop feeling sad, or I just can't stop feeling anxious. So that is anxiety symptoms and myths in a nutshell, and then I'll let James talk to you more about what to do with that, what we do in therapy, and how, again, as providers, teachers, parents, how you interact with kids experiencing some of that stuff.
I'm going to do this paperwork stuff really quick, just kind of fly through this, because I don't like standing behind a podium. I like walking around, but there's also a handheld mic, so I might throw it or something, so I'm a little nervous about that. Okay, Melissa said that, you know, we're both a little nervous. Of course, yes. I want to make sure that I do a good job, right? But more specifically, that I don't waste your time, right? That I'm demonstrating skillfulness and competency, that I'm respectful to, again, the time that you guys are here, you know? So, most of us, right, would get caught up on the anxiety, and like Melissa said, end there, right? I'm anxious. Mine says, great, don't do this thing, right? That showed up a lot, you know, not like 2 months ago whenever we scheduled this thing, right? I was like, okay, whatever, that's like a million years away, right? But this week, particularly, you know, an hour before, my mind's like, can't you just say you got, I don't know, some disease or something and cancel the whole thing? How would anyone know, right? It could. My mind was definitely urging that, but that wasn't in line with my values or what's meaningful. Not at all, you know. It would have relieved the anxiety right away. Totally would have. I would have been super happy to have done that, right? Could be sitting at home, doing whatever. But then tomorrow, I'd probably feel really guilty or ashamed or embarrassed or something else, right? And then my mind would say, well, you idiot, why'd you cancel that, right? My mind set up the trap. Totally set up the trap, right? So this is an interesting thing. We'll get more into that stuff. I'm going to go through 6 Different things. Some people call them pivots. It doesn't matter what we call them. We can call them whatever, okay? But these are little things. If you want to write them down, you can. I'll look at my paper and read specific things, and I'll slow down that way. If you want to write them down, you can, and we can talk a bit more about what they look like in practice, okay? Is that fair? Okay, so the first thing is diffusion. So a simple way to look at this is we see our thoughts with enough distance that we can choose what we do next, regardless of our mind's chatter. See our thoughts with enough distance that we can choose what we do next, regardless of our mind's chatter. So you can also think of this as hooking or unhooking, right? Again, if I would have got hooked on what my mind said about the anxiety, right? To get away, run away, okay? If I would have fused with that thought, I wouldn't be here tonight, right? That's how that looks. Matter of fact, since we're in a high school, I'll bring this up. And I went to Southeast. I don't know if you guys can pull records and hold this against me or not. I think I was a sophomore in high school. It was an English class, and I think we were supposed to do some kind of little presentation on something. It was probably just a minute or two long, but I hated talking in front of people. I was super nervous, part probably because I would stutter or, you know, what other people would think of what I had to say. I have no idea what the exact thing was, but I do know that I was super anxious about it. So I remember walking into the classroom, and my teacher was sitting at her desk. I think it was just right by the door. And I went up to her, and now I don't remember if I must have said something, but it was like, I lost my voice. Something like that. I couldn't use too much of my voice, right? She would have known. I definitely did not lose my voice, and I'm sure I wasn't like a super chatty kid in any of my classes, so maybe the 3 or 4 periods before that class, I didn't say anything in those classes. So she, from what I can remember, was super nice about it. She said, oh, okay. So I didn't have to say anything, right? So super anxious going into that, right? When I did that, how do you think I felt? Relieved? Yeah, super stoked. I'm like, yeah, that totally worked. That's awesome, right? And I don't recall now exactly when, you know, again, I felt that embarrassment and guilt and shame. Might have been later that night or the next day, but it definitely came. And then there was a lot of regret when I found out that I failed the damn project because talking was part of it, right? So my mind beat me up again about that, right? So the idea of fusing, getting hooked, getting caught up in what our mind says about something, right? In order to protect, right? So being able to put some distance in between. This is something when I'm talking to folks, we do a variety of different things, and one thing might be something like this. I notice I'm having the thought, or I notice I'm having the feeling, and you just plug it in. I don't know if there's anything necessarily magical about that, but it definitely puts a wedge in between me and my thoughts, right? It separates out the idea that I am my thoughts, or I am my mind, right? I assume most of you have feet in here. I can see some of them. Are you your foot? If you lost your foot, would you be any less you? See some no's and some yeses? Okay, this is something that's kind of tricky. Most of my clients say, well, yeah, I'd be less me. It's like, well, you'd be less a foot, but you would not be less you, right? Like, I don't think anyone, I'm making a huge assumption here, I don't think anyone sees somebody that is missing a foot and says, hey, Bill, nice to see most of you. No one says that. That would be ridiculous to say, right? And pretty rude, you know? The idea is that we know that our body parts are not who we are, right? Matter of fact, none of you look the same as you did when you were 2 days old. Is that true? Yeah, right? You've changed. And I think, if there's any science teachers in here, you can correct me on this, that on a cellular level, right, our cells change every, I think, 7 years. We don't have the same cells, right? So even on that level, we're changing all the time, right? Which is fascinating and proves this idea that we are not what you see. And if that's true, it's also true that we are not what's in here. We're not our thoughts and our feelings and our sensations, right? But our mind can definitely get us caught up thinking that that's the case. So many folks come into my office and they say, hey, James, I'm bipolar. That's interesting. It gives you a lot of information. This over-identification with something, right? So that out of the gate gets me a bit nervous because I already know, okay, their mind has really spun this story about this internal experience and who they are, right? And if that's the case, they must be living life like bipolar, right? Or depressed or anxious or whatever, right? Which is kind of fascinating, the stories, right? So diffusion, we'll kind of get more into that. Here's the second thing, self, okay? Notice the story we've constructed of ourselves and gain perspective about who we are. Okay, so I'm guessing that a lot of you have heard the concept of ego, which just means I. So this idea of a conceptualized self, right? That's really about the stories of who we are, right? What our mind tells us about who we are. Again, kind of going back to I am bipolar, or I'm a therapist, or I'm a parent, or I'm whatever, a teacher, you know. The stories and how we can get all caught up in holding that real tight, right? And when we're countered with other information, we can get all ticked off, you know, and then defend and defend and defend. Again, back to this fight, flight, freeze type of thing. Our mind says, oh, here's a threat, now we got to defend it. As if we're really going to die, right? That's how our mind sees these things, very black and white. Anything that's painful is like death. I know that sounds pretty extreme. That's how mind sees it. That's the only way it can see it. We can see it in a different way, kind of that ambiguous gray space, right? Again, if we back up and say, wait a second, this isn't death. I'm not actually being threatened here, right? This is a painful emotion or a painful thought or whatever, right? So if we slip into this perspective-taking self, right? Being able to observe, to notice, to witness what's going on, right? Your mind instantly comes up with one perspective. I could say something outrageous right now, boom, and your mind would say, oh my gosh, that guy's out of his mind. Something, or maybe some of you would say, oh, that guy seems like somebody I would want to hang out with. I don't know. But your mind would have a perspective instantly on it, right? Without your choosing. Without your choosing. Some of you probably get shocked with what comes up in your mind. Like, what the hell is that about? I didn't notice that. Like, what does that say about me? Well, it says nothing about you. Nothing at all, right? But if you talk to some therapists, they'd say it means a lot about you. I disagree with that. So when we're aware of what's going on in our internal experience, we now have some freedom, control, and power. We can decide what to do with that, right? We can say, yeah, you know what? I don't know if I am a fan of this perspective. What's another perspective I can take on this and slip into that? Does it take some effort and work? Yeah, of course it does, right? We're not asking anyone to debate with their mind, because you'll lose every time, right? Like, if anyone has ever dealt with, kind of going back to something that Melissa said, with I don't know, maybe some self-image stuff, right? And a lot of messages about maybe how you look or what your worth is or something like this, right? Let's just do, I'm ugly, right? If that's a narrative that shows up often. And if you replace that with, no, I'm a beautiful person. If you do that every day, that doesn't change anything. Your mind sees the BS, right? And it just goes back to everything that proves its point, right? So we can shift perspective and we can say, wait a second, that's what my mind has to say. Doesn't mean I have to step into that. It's tricky, 100% tricky. Very, very tricky. The idea here is that when we slip into a different perspective, we look at how does this suit me? Is this helpful? Is it helpful for me to think that I'm ugly? Is that something that is in line with my values and gets me to where I want to go? Or is me slipping into something else, another perspective, more in line with where I want to go? We'll get more into that as we go here as well. So the third thing, acceptance. Allow ourselves to feel, even when the feelings are painful, or create a sense of vulnerability. So this is pivoting from experiential avoidance to acceptance. So we allow ourselves to feel even when the feelings are painful or create a sense of vulnerability. Who loves to feel pain? Yeah, not many people, right? And people tell you not to. Hey, Forget it. Move away from it, ignore it, distract yourself, get drunk, do whatever, right? Just don't feel, right? So, and then you do years of doing that, then you get yelled at for not being in touch with your feelings, right? It's a damn game, and it's one we usually lose, you know? So, the idea of acceptance, we can use different words because sometimes acceptance, like mindfulness, can be a dirty word because of certain groups maybe hijacking it and it just sounds a certain way, right? We could say opening up, you know, allowing, making space for, right? Our mind can really act like tunnel vision, right? Like if you took your hands and did like this thing, can't see much, right? Your experience is now narrow, right? And a lot of people, most of us, go through life like that, right? But when we open up, make room for things, it's different, right? Because this stuff is still here no matter what, right? No matter what, it's still here. So, allowing the painful stuff to be there because it is there. And a big thing for this, I think, is that our mind, you know, instantly judges this crap, right? And that's reinforced by society, right? Again, Melissa hit on this, I think, a bit. The idea that certain feelings are good and certain feelings are bad, or positive, negative, healthy, unhealthy, rational, irrational, logical, illogical. That's all made up. Anything that goes on in here is not, let me rephrase that. Anything that goes on in here is void of any value. What I mean by that is that one thought isn't more or less important than another thought, isn't more or less dangerous than another thought, right? I'm going to go for the gold with this example. A thought of baking a cake isn't more or less bad than the thought of suicide. It isn't, but we're told it is, that the thought of suicide is like actually completing the act of suicide. This is not a true thing. But when we get told that, it's like we get put into this hypnotic induction. If you have thoughts of suicide, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. That's made up. People have said that, right? Definitely, it doesn't feel comfortable. It feels really unpleasant, right? Just like a lot of other thoughts can feel really unpleasant, or sensations can feel really unpleasant, right? Really uncomfortable. The idea of judging and placing evaluation on internal experiences now move us away from acceptance, right? Moves us towards something else. What do we like to do with bad stuff? Hold it near and dear or get rid of it? Think about somebody who has internal experiences and they're told that that's bad, that's illogical, that's irrational. What's the next step? Oh, they start making that about themselves. Well, I must be bad. It's in here. That must be who I am. If that's who I am, why the hell do I want to live? It's a serious thing. So if we can step away and say, wait a second, maybe the stuff that shows up here, yeah, there's no judgment there. There's no evaluation. Maybe it's not better or worse. Again, rational or irrational. Something I don't like. You know, I never encourage people to like experiences. They don't have to, right? I don't like experiences that I have. You know, the anxiety I was feeling before this, I didn't like it. But guess what? It comes along for the ride, and I know it's there. And if I can jump ahead to another one, values, right? It's in service of my values. So here's a line for this. Choose the qualities of being and doing that we want to evolve toward. Choose the qualities of being and doing that we want to evolve toward. Values are something that are never accomplished. It's always the act of doing, right? Being kind is never fully achieved. It's always a process. It's a lifelong journey, right? There can be specific goals along the way, right? Like, let's say if I value connectedness and I want a relationship, well, I can achieve that, right? And I use the value of connectedness to get there, right? Values of honesty or loyalty, whatever it might be, you know. Self-care, right? Fitness, you know, the value of fitness is ongoing, but working out can be achieved on a daily basis or whatever. You can have specific goals for that, right? So, again, we get caught up in this idea that if we have feelings, they're bad, certain feelings, right, are bad, and that means we should just stop. Stop. But we don't think about, wait a second, is this in service of something, right? So for example, if for whatever reason I could no longer be a therapist, let's say I lose my voice and I'm not, I don't know, I don't have the skills to learn sign language, right? So now I'm out of a job, okay? And the only gig I can get is cleaning the public restrooms in Lincoln, right? I don't like that gig, not at all, but I would be the first in line to do it because it would be in service of a lot of values, right? One of the important things would be providing for my family. So you bet, would I be happy about the gig? No, why would I be? Some people might be, and that's fine. And if they are, then they should be, right? But I wouldn't be, and it would be pointless to force myself to be, right? But it's in service of something bigger, right? It's in service of something bigger, and that's the thing. Folks who, generally speaking, who go through depression, the flip side of that is that these are folks that are probably yearning to feel fulfilled. Folks who go through maybe anxiety around, I don't know, social situations or something, may have a yearning to be connected, right? Have meaningful relationships, right? So there's a lot of things that go on with this, and it just doesn't end at our internal experience, right? At the feeling. There's more to it than just that. Two more things here with this. Presence. This is direct attention in an intentional way rather than by mere habit. Noticing what is present here and now, inside us and out. Being aware, being mindful, right? Noticing, okay, what's going on in my head, in my body right now? What's going on out here? This is a way for us to get grounded, to be one with our experience versus being caught up in specifically what our mind wants us to say, right? Wants us to do, wants us to whatever, get dragged away with. So our mind, it is said, and I think in your guys' experience living with a mind, you'll agree with this, that our mind can only do certain things like ruminate, problem solve, worry, create a ton of stories about things, right? The thing it can't do is exist in the present. If we all did a present exercise, just a mindfulness exercise right now, you would notice how your mind wanders all around. Hell, right now, you guys thinking of anything else? When Melissa was talking, did your mind wander? When I'm talking, is your mind thinking about when's this guy gonna be done talking? When can I go home? I'm starving, whatever. Have you had other thoughts than what we've been talking about tonight? Yeah, and that's fine, you're a human. You're a human. I have too, I have too. A matter of fact, if you see me forget a thought, that's probably because I got caught up on another thought, right? Oh, okay. It's not a big deal, right? So when we're aware of the chatter, when we can observe, and you guys noticing that proves that there's a mind and there's you. Call it whatever you want, but this is what it looks like, right? So if we can observe that stuff, again, we're ahead of the game, right? We can get present, we can say, this is what my mind is doing. Do I want to do that? Is that helpful? Is that leading me towards a meaningful and enriching life? Or is that pulling me in a different direction, away from my values, right? More towards this survival thing, Okay, let's see, I think this is the last of the 6. Action. Create habits that support these choices. Create habits that support these choices. So, take values-based action, right? We move in those directions. We don't have to do that all the time because that would be counterproductive. The approach that Melissa and I use is called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, okay? So, it is based on not how you feel, but what you do. Oftentimes I might tell somebody who sits in my office, I don't really care how you feel. I want to know how you do, right? This is interesting, I think, and maybe some of you have done this. I used to do this, and I still get hooked sometimes and do this. People will come in, I say, hey, what's the past week been like? And they'll say, oh, miserable. Like, oh my, what's gone on? I've just been sad. Oh. Okay, what else has gone on? Well, and then I find out, okay, they actually went to work, or they hung out with friends, or they did activities that are enriching to their life, but their mind told them that the most important thing was how they felt. For any of you, and I'm guessing a lot of you have filled out job applications, did interviews, Anywhere on there, did they ask about your feelings? How do you feel? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I say that facetiously, but it really doesn't, right? That doesn't get the job done, right? Like, I don't really care if if I'm having, I don't know, heart surgery and my doctor feels a certain way. I just want to know my doctor is going to do a competent job, right? That's important, more so than how the doctor is feeling, right? Now, if the doctor gets hooked and is anxious and that's being demonstrated in shaky hands, now I care, right? Because now the doctor ain't doing a good job, right? Isn't demonstrating competency or skillfulness. Those are values. Those are values, right? If I'm in my office and I'm caught up, let's say, on thoughts about, I don't know, my daughters, super caught up in that. Am I serving the person across from me well? If any of you with students or your own kids, right, are caught up in your own stuff, how could you serve them well, right? So both Melissa and I laid out, put the light on what our internal experience is right now. Like, yeah, this is what's going on. Because it's not a big deal, right? Yeah, there's some anxiety. And we move towards our values, right? So this idea of, in this field of therapy, for a second, I'll just clump all this under we'll say the mental health umbrella, therapy, psychiatry, and psychology. There's a lot of really great stuff that comes out of there. There's also a lot of harmful stuff that comes out of there. I assume like any field. And some of that is this notion that the experiences we experience, again, are negative and bad, the internal stuff that we have. And then you're disordered. Most of the individuals I work with, particularly the adolescents, they can kind of see through this, they can kind of see through this. And I have some adults that can see through this too, that these are experiences, Heck, I have some adolescents that come in and they say, hey, I don't like your profession. I think it sucks. I'm like, all right, that's fair. You can. Because they feel like it's social control, right? And I get what they're saying. It sure can feel that. Or especially some kids that come in and, they smoke a ton of weed and they say, I don't get it. My parents want me to stop the weed but start a medication. What's the difference? They got a great point. They have a fantastic point, And I totally get that. And oddly enough, these medications don't do what they claim to do. They just don't. And I see that all the time. I see that when folks come into my office and they say I'm depressed and they show me the list of medications they're on, and they're still depressed. It's about living, right? These folks aren't living, Kids come in sometimes drooling, right? Because they're on these medications, potent stuff, right? To try to get away from feelings. What do you take if you got depression? An antidepressant. Get away from how you feel, right? Oddly enough, the research that's been done shows that things are getting worse, not better, even though we have more therapists and more medications. Isn't this interesting? Depression, I'm going to look at my paper here because I got this little stat. These are the stats I like. In 1990, depression was the 4th leading cause of disability and disease worldwide. In 2000, it ranked 2nd. In 2017, the World Health Organization ranked it 1st. So approximately 40 million Americans over the age of 18 have been diagnosed as having an anxiety disorder, and almost 10% report frequent mental distress. So even though we have all this, I'll use technology loosely, all this technology, whether it's in this field or just in general, it hasn't got us any closer to feeling better, right? Or living more meaningfully or enriched, right? Matter of fact, one could argue it's pulled us away from that. Now this is interesting too. There are more people, and this is as of 2007, but I think that's just when the most numbers for this were released. At the end of 2007, more than 60% of people with psychological conditions were using only medication. So over the years, it's gone down. It used to be higher. The therapy approaches used to be higher. Most people did therapy and then some medication. And over the years, it's just been medication, which is kind of scary, right? Again, if there's something to fix how I feel, I want to fix it, right? Versus being with it, versus leading a more meaningful life. Another example of people looking for a quick fix, I have some parents that say, hey, you know, little Billy isn't sleeping well, right? Let's say little Billy's 14. So we got him some melatonin, or maybe they get some high-powered medication to, you know, put him to sleep. And the thing is that little Billy is on a screen 5 hours a day, you know, right before bedtime, isn't going to bed until 1 in the morning, right? Waking up at maybe 6 or 7, isn't doing things that are in line with effective sleep habits, right? And you find out some more stuff, and this kid is overwhelmed at school, or maybe there's some family stuff or whatever. All these things are matters in living, not medication issues, right? So when we look at how to be with someone who's coming to us, you know, with stuff going on, right? I like to say, well, we approach it in a way that humans always, you know, maybe have, and that's noticing what's going on, right? Noticing what's going on, connecting with somebody, listening to what they have to say, right? So some of these strategies in terms of how to deal with this, we can say, it is really about connecting. It's for a person to connect with their experience, right? Even though their mind wants them to do something else. So in a sense, it's turning towards, not away from our experiences. Melissa brought up the whole sticks and stones thing. You know, so in the one sense, it is true that words can break us, right? I could say some stuff right now that your minds would have a super strong reaction to, right? And instantly would want to fight, okay? Boom, got hooked on that. As if what I said was literally true, as if the words had some, and this is a weird concept, we don't have to get too much into this, had universal meaning, right? I forgot to do this. I was gonna look up some old-timey profanity, right? Something that none of us would probably know, something maybe from a few hundred years ago or something. I could say it, none of you would probably know it. It probably sounds silly, right? But maybe from a couple hundred years ago, that would have got me murdered or something, you know? This just proves how things are not inherently true, right? Like my name, James, doesn't mean anything. We've given it meaning. We've agreed that it means something. Depression, anxiety, any diagnosis doesn't mean anything. The experience is 100% valid. When somebody comes in and says, this is what's going on for me, I believe it. It's completely valid. But the idea that it is something is completely made up. We've given it a label, and then our mind grasps that. Because again, like what Melissa was saying, if our thoughts, if language evolved because of a survival mechanism, right? Like it's much easier to say, hey, don't go in the woods, you'll die, than grunt and do all that stuff, right? More efficient, more effective. A theory is that language evolved from that, and from that, our mind evolved. And that's why there's always all these survival strategies, right? Move towards this, get away, get away, get away, don't feel pain. Again, because you might die, which we know isn't true. So, the idea that these terms are true is not true. If you want to give that power, you can. Because if I said depression, and now, you know, Melissa kind of hit on this, so you're already primed. If I said depression, is that good or bad? In presentations I've given before, most people say bad, right? Anxiety, bad. Bipolar, bad. Schizophrenia, bad. Okay, the language there, right? But if we started talking about experiences, that's a little bit more difficult. I don't know, like if I said, I have this sensation in my chest that does this, and then there's a sensation in my head that feels dull but swells and recedes and does this motion, or a swimmy motion. It's kind of hard. I mean, I guess our mind still might want to judge that, right? But we're in a different game, right? In a similar way, if I said, tell me what comes to mind when I say tree. We'll all have a different image, but if I described the tree, we would all have the same image, right? Or at least pretty close. So a thing that we do a lot is ask folks to describe their experiences, stepping away from the intellectual process that our mind so loves to do. And what a lot of therapists do, they get intellectual with it. But if we get experiential with it, it becomes different. Like, in order to play a guitar, what do you have to do? Play the guitar, right? You could have somebody tell you music theory and show you how to play it without you ever touching the guitar, but I guarantee you will not be able to play the guitar. You sit and you play it. And it can be embarrassing, and it can be a struggle, it can be a hassle, it can be disappointing and frustrating and all those things, right? But it's in service of getting somewhere else. So when it comes to moving towards our values, coming into contact with our experiences, actually means coming into contact with our experiences, sitting with that. And when we sit with that, we realize, oh yeah, it gets really uncomfortable. And that's that. Our mind will say we'll explode or melt or something, but we won't. We won't. That just won't happen. And when we do that, when we practice with that, we realize, oh yeah, I can stay in contact with this. And I don't like it, but I don't have to act just because my mind says to. I can do it based off of what's important to me. So, has anyone ever heard respect is earned? I only give respect to people that give me respect. Okay, yeah. That's another way of saying I'm not going to be responsible for my own behaviors, right? That I'm pawning it off on someone else. So are you saying that if respect is a big value of yours, that somehow it is out the window when somebody calls you a name or disrespects you, that now you can show that person disrespect? It's kind of an interesting concept, right? That if somebody, one of you right now, stood up and said, hey, James, I think you're full of crap. Okay, you might be right. You can have that thought. The idea is that I wouldn't slip into being disrespectful. My mind will start saying things. Absolutely, I can't prevent that. And I can notice that and say, yes, there's that. And right now, I want to be respectful. Demonstrate some kindness or consideration, whatever it might be, right? Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.